Welcome back. Find a comfortable position and let the day begin to fall away. Tonight, let's slip quietly into the calm wisdom of Epictetus and the peace of letting go. If these carry you off to sleep, subscribe. A new one comes every night. A boy moves through noise. The city arrives before its streets do, in the smell of animals and rendered fat, in the sound of iron on stone, in the particular quality of a crowd that does not know it is a crowd, but simply presses, turns, adjusts, and presses again. He has come from Hierapolis, a Greek-speaking city in Phrygia, set among hot springs and white mineral terraces, a place where the scale of human life still fits inside a morning's walk. Rome does not fit inside anything. Its noise is not the noise of people, but the noise of a place that has forgotten what quiet was before it grew into the thing it has become. The boy's name, given to him by whoever owned him when the name was given, means something like acquired in Greek. Not a name so much as a notation, a record of a transaction written in the syllables of an identity. He would have entered the city the way goods enter a city, as part of a consignment, in the company of other people whose legal status matched his own, moving through streets whose Latin inscriptions were not addressed to him. The language of power in Rome was Latin. The language of philosophy, of medicine, of mathematics was Greek. He possessed one of these and had no access to the other in any form that mattered. What the streets announced, the names of emperors, the dedications to gods, the painted notices of gladiatorial contests, was addressed to a Roman public of which he was not a member. The noise and scale of the city were not hostile to him. They were simply indifferent, which is a different quality, and in some ways harder to absorb. Hostility at least acknowledges its object. The city moved around him the way water moves around a stone, not because it had found a way past him, but because he had not yet become visible to it. He was property of Epictetus, a freedman who had himself once been enslaved, and had since risen within the administrative apparatus of the imperial court to the kind of wealth and influence that the Roman system occasionally permitted, those who had begun with nothing and ended with the right patron. Epictetus was secretary to Nero, which is to say, he occupied a position of proximity to power, so complete that the distinction between serving power and wielding it had become, in practical terms, difficult to draw. Into this household the boy arrived. The household's world was the world of imperial Rome, at its most pressured, administrative, competitive, capable of sudden reversal, and whatever the boy watched in those first years, in that house, he watched it with the attention of someone who had no other instrument at his disposal. His name, in its plain Greek sense, was simply the past participle of the verb to acquire, epictetos, gotten, obtained. The word that appears in a commercial inventory between the description of goods and the record of their price, that a man whose name marked him as something obtained would spend his life teaching that no human being can be genuinely possessed, that the only real property is internal and cannot be taken by any legal instrument yet devised, carries in it a precision that doctrine alone could not have produced. The philosophy would later articulate this as a formal principle, but the biographical fact preceded the principle by decades, and the principle carries in its grain the specific pressure of having been formed by someone to whom the question of ownership was not abstract. What it meant to be a slave in Rome in the first century of the Common Era was not uniform. The category covered an enormous range of material conditions, from agricultural labor on estates where life was brutal and short, to positions of significant administrative responsibility within wealthy households. The conditions constant was legal. Whatever the material circumstance, the enslaved person had no legal standing, no recognized family, no right to anything they wore or held or knew or had learned. The law recognized only the property relation. Everything else, intelligence, loyalty, acquired skill, philosophical understanding, existed outside the law's interest. In a household as connected to imperial power as Epaphroditus's, a young man of evident intelligence might find himself in proximity to conversations about literature, about rhetoric, about the philosophical schools whose members were visible in Rome's public life. Whether that proximity was available to the boy who had arrived from Hierapolis is not recorded. What is recorded much later is the philosophical result, a man whose thinking had been tested against conditions the law created, and philosophy could not dissolve. There is an account recorded by Origen, the Christian theologian writing in the 3rd century, in which Epaphroditus tortured his slave's leg. The account describes Epictetus responding with a kind of measured calm. He told his master, it is said, that the bone would break. When it did, he observed that he had said so. The account is not contemporary. It comes to us at a significant remove, and may carry in it the exaggerations that such stories tend to gather as they move through time. But the account has attached itself to the philosophical tradition with a persistence that suggests it answered something in the way later readers encountered Epictetus's own teaching, that the body and the will inhabit different categories, that what happens to one cannot, without the self's own cooperation, determine what becomes of the other. Whether or not the scene occurred exactly as described, what it gestures toward is real. A man who would go on to teach that suffering arises not from events, but from the relationship of the mind to events, was making that claim from a position that had no philosophical safety net beneath it. The body was not, for him, a theoretical entity whose pain could be treated as a thought experiment. It was the specific body that had been owned, directed, and in at least some accounts physically damaged while belonging to another person. The steadiness the account describes is not the steadiness of someone who had never been hurt. It is the steadiness of someone who had been, and had found something that the hurt could not enter. There are places in Epictetus's later teaching, preserved not in his own writing, but in the records his students kept, where the voice is entirely distinct from the composed academic register of most philosophical texts. There is impatience, directness, a particular quality of urgency that comes from someone who is not interested in the philosophy as an intellectual exhibition, but as a set of instruments for actual use. When he said later, to a student who had come to him with distress about his circumstances, that what was his to manage and what was not his to manage were distinguishable, he said it with the authority of a man who had made that distinction in circumstances where philosophy's claims about it could have been immediately falsified, and had found under that pressure that they held. Musonius Rufus was alive in Rome when Epictetus was young. He was known later as the Roman Socrates, and the comparison was not merely honorific. It named a similarity of method, which was the conviction that philosophy was not a discipline to be performed in texts or lectures, but a daily practice applied to the actual texture of one's life. He had been exiled from Rome more than once, had returned, and continued teaching through political circumstances that a more cautious man might have treated as instructions to stop. He taught that philosophy was not an intellectual luxury for those who had the leisure and social position to pursue it, but a moral discipline, as necessary as bread, necessary not because it was pleasant, but because living without it, living purely by habit and reaction, and the desires one had been handed by circumstance, was a kind of self-abandonment. He accepted students without regard to social station. This was not, in the Rome of his time, unremarkable. Education in philosophy was the property of those who had the freedom and material resources to acquire it. That Musonius taught regardless of a student's formal status meant that the philosophical life was, in his practice, and not only in his doctrine, genuinely available to those who had been denied it by every other social institution. A young enslaved man in Rome attending these teaching sessions would have found in Musonius not only arguments, but a demonstration. The demonstration was this, that philosophy's availability did not depend on one's position in the hierarchy the city took for granted, that a person without legal standing could nonetheless inhabit the philosophical life in the only way the philosophical life could actually be inhabited, through the daily committed application of its principles to one's own responses, judgments, and orientations. What Epictetus took from Musonius was not a doctrine he would not have encountered elsewhere. The Stoic teachings had been circulating in Rome for over a century by the time he encountered them. What he took was the living example of a man for whom philosophy was not separated from conduct by even a hair's width. Musonius's teaching was demanding, concrete, uncomfortable in the way that genuine moral examination tends to be uncomfortable. He asked his students not to agree with his arguments, but to live differently as a result of them. He thought that philosophical discussion that did not result in a changed way of living was not philosophy, but entertainment. The young man who was listening to those sessions from among the students of rank was testing every sentence, not against other arguments, but against the conditions of his own life, which was perhaps the strictest test available. Domitian became emperor in 81 CE. The philosophical schools had always been an uneasy presence in Rome from the perspective of imperial authority, not because of anything most philosophers said about politics, but because of the structure of philosophical communities, which were organized around loyalty to a teacher and a practice rather than to the state. Philosophical friendship, as the schools understood it, was a bond whose authority the emperor could not simply commandeer. This structural independence was enough to make some emperors suspicious, and Domitian was more suspicious than most. Around 89 CE, and continuing into the 90s, he expelled the philosophers from Rome. Epictetus was among those expelled. He went to Nicopolis, a city in northwestern Greece, founded by Augustus near the site of his victory at Actium, and there he opened a school. That this is how his story goes, that the imperial power that expelled him thereby created the conditions for one of the most significant philosophical teaching careers in the ancient world, is not a dramatic irony the tradition has invented for aesthetic effect. It is simply what happened. The portable philosophy, the one that required no particular building or city or social position to survive, turned out to be portable in exactly the way its possessor had been teaching. Epictetus arrived in Nicopolis with the only thing the law had never been able to confiscate, and set up an operation that attracted students from across the Roman world. The school in Nicopolis was not an institution with endowments or a formal charter. It was a teacher and the students who came to sit with him. Some of these students were men of considerable social standing who had traveled specifically to hear him. The teaching sessions were, by all accounts, preserved in the records that followed. Not lectures, but confrontations. The Socratic method translated into Stoic terms. The teacher identifying where a student's stated beliefs and actual conduct had separated, asking questions until the student could see the gap for himself. Epictetus had no patience for philosophy as performance. The discourses, the record we have of those teaching sessions, contain passages where his voice sharpens, almost to severity, when a student seems more interested in discussing philosophical concepts than in applying them. The distinction in his teaching between understanding a principle and being capable of using it under pressure was not a fine one, it was the central one. He lived simply. The account we have, which is again at some distance from the original, describes a home of great material plainness, a mattress, a lamp, and the minimum of everything else. This is the kind of detail that philosophical biography tends to add to figures it wishes to present as exemplars, and some skepticism is appropriate, but the teaching itself carries no contradiction of this. Epictetus taught that preferred indifferents were preferred precisely because they were indifferent, warmth over cold, sufficiency over want, and that a philosopher's life expressed, in its material choices, the same hierarchy of values the philosophy itself articulated. A man who taught that external goods were not the source of genuine well-being, and who then lived in evident luxury, would have been doing something his own students would have noticed. The simplicity may be embellished in the telling. The basic coherence between the life and the teaching seems across all the evidence available to hold he did not write. This is the central fact of Epictetan transmission. The man who is now known primarily through two texts, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, produced neither of them. He taught in spoken sessions that were, from his perspective, the only medium through which philosophy genuinely traveled. Written text could be reproduced, circulated, read in isolation from a living teacher, and in that isolation it would become inert, words about wisdom, rather than the active transmission of wisdom between one breathing person and another. Socrates had felt something similar, and the comparison Musonius drew was not accidental. Philosophy, in this tradition, was not a body of propositions to be memorized, but a living practice to be transmitted, the way a flame is transmitted, not by describing fire, but by bringing one light close enough to another that the second catches. Arian of Nicomedia was a student in Nicopolis during the years when Epictetus was teaching. He was not a marginal figure. He went on to become a significant Greek historian, a Roman senator, a general, and the governor of the province of Cappadocia. He was, by every measure the ancient world had for such things, a man of standing. He sat in those teaching sessions with his stylus and took notes. He did not tell Epictetus he was doing this, or if he did not describe it as the production of a text, merely the preservation of a record. What emerged from his notes eventually became the Discourses, 8 books of which 4 survive, and from those a further condensed text he assembled called the Enchiridion, from the Greek word for a small handbook, something held in the hand rather than housed in a library. Arian seems to have been aware that the act of preservation was also an act of translation. In letters associated with the Discourses, he makes clear that he was attempting to record the living quality of the teaching sessions, the directness, the impatience, the specific pressure of a teacher who believed that what he was saying had immediate practical stakes. He knew that writing something down transformed it, the urgency of a spoken challenge, directed at a specific person, in a specific moment of that person's confusion or resistance, becomes in written form a general proposition addressed to no one in particular. The particular force that the teaching had when Epictetus leaned forward and asked a student how he intended to live was not something any text could fully recover. What Arian was doing was the best available option, not the ideal one, and the slight inadequacy of the medium was something he appears to have understood from the beginning. What the Enchiridion begins with, that some things are in our power and others are not, was not in the sessions where Epictetus taught it, the opening sentence of a philosophical treatise. It was something a teacher said to a student who was suffering. It was said with the authority of someone who had tested it, not in thought experiments, but in the lived experience of having had no external power at all. The teaching sessions in Nicopolis were full of students who had come with real distress about reputation, about ambition, about the distance between what they wanted and what circumstances were offering. Epictetus met that distress with a question: which part of this is actually yours to manage? The question was not unkind. It was the most useful thing he could offer. The stylus moved across the wax tablet at the edge of the room. Arian's hand recorded what it could: the argument's structure, the teacher's examples, something of the voice's particular directness. The lamp at the edge of the space would have given uneven light, and the room in Nicopolis was not the city where this philosophy had been born. The students around Arian came from different parts of the Roman world, and the teacher at the center of the room had arrived in this city by way of a property transfer in Rome, a name that meant something had been acquired, a household run by an imperial administrator, sessions with Musonius Rufus that had given the young enslaved man not only arguments, but a living model of what philosophy looked like when it was being genuinely inhabited, an expulsion from Rome that had cleared the ground for this specific school in this specific place to exist. None of what had been applied against that life had managed to dissolve it. The legal instrument that had reduced a person to property had not, in the end, reached what it would have needed to reach to make that reduction complete. The philosophical tradition that Musonius had passed to him was not a tradition that depended on favorable conditions for its practice. It had been designed, over centuries, precisely for unfavorable ones. The exile that was meant to silence the philosophical schools had given Epictetus the distance from Rome's noise and pressure that his teaching apparently needed in order to become what it became. The lamp in the teaching room was burning. Arian's stylus was moving. The sentences that would travel across centuries and arrive in the hands of emperors, prisoners, therapists, monastics, and ordinary people lying awake in the dark, trying to understand what, if anything, was genuinely theirs to hold. Those sentences were forming in the imperfect medium of a wax tablet in a provincial city in Greece, under the hands of a student who knew he was doing something approximate and did it anyway with care. What Epictetus himself held, through all of it, was not a doctrine about holding. It was the thing the doctrine was trying to describe. The name that had been assigned to him at whatever moment property changed hands had named him as something gotten, something acquired by another. The philosophy that he would spend his life teaching said that nothing essential could be gotten by another, that the only genuine acquisition was internal, and that it was available. This was the part no legal system could touch, to anyone willing to attend carefully to the quality of their own judgments, their own assents, their own orientations toward what they took to matter. The teaching sessions would end each day. Students would move out into the evening in Nicopolis. Arian would carry his notes back to wherever he was staying and transcribe them more carefully. Epictetus would return to whatever the simple space was that served as his home and prepare for the next day's work. Outside, the city went about its business, which was ordinary commerce, domestic life, the politics of the local community, and had no particular relationship to the extraordinary fact that in a room somewhere in that city, a man who had been legally defined as property was teaching other men, many of them legally, his superiors in every framework the Roman world could name, how to locate the one thing that no legal framework had ever managed to regulate. The wax held what it could. Arian carried what the wax held. The sentences crossed centuries the way certain things cross centuries, not because they were protected by institutions or carved into monuments, but because they kept being found to be useful by people who had come at their own particular points of difficulty to the question of what was genuinely theirs to manage and what was not. The text arrived in those hands across the long distance between Nicopolis and everywhere else, and what it brought with it, underneath the arguments and the formal philosophical apparatus, was the specific authority of a life that had tested its own claims in the only conditions where testing was not theoretical. A child had arrived in Rome with a name that meant something had been gotten. A free man had left Rome carrying the only architecture that the decree of an emperor could not confiscate. A teacher had opened a school in a city that was not his choice, and found that the school was exactly what the philosophy had always been preparing for. And at the edge of the room where the teaching happened, a young man's stylus was moving across wax and the lamplight, trying to preserve in marks on a surface what could only fully live in the air between a teacher and a student, doing the approximate and essential work of carrying forward what could not be allowed to end. The flame passed from one wick to another, imperfectly, losing a little in the transfer, arriving diminished, and still burning. The notes became a text. The text crossed the centuries. What could not be destroyed by the ownership of a child, the breaking of a leg, the decree of an emperor, or the silence of a man who refused to write, found its way forward anyway, carried in the attentive and slightly inadequate hand of a student who had understood that what he was listening to was worth the attempt. Some things belong to us, others do not, and knowing the difference, Epictetus said, is where everything begins. He did not say it gently, the way a person offers comfort. He said it the way a physician states a diagnosis, with the particular directness of someone who has looked at the evidence carefully and seen no reason to soften it. The student before him was in distress. The world had not arranged itself as the student had hoped. And Epictetus, sitting in the open air of Nicopolis, turned to face the distress, not with sympathy, but with something steadier than sympathy, with the precise, unhurried attention of a man who has found the source of a problem and wants the person suffering to see it too. The first sentence of the Enchiridion arrives like this: not as an opening to an argument that will build toward a conclusion somewhere further in, not as a preamble, as the thing itself, stated plainly, already complete. Some things are up to us, others are not. Opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, these belong to us. Body, reputation, command, and circumstance, these do not. The student hearing this for the first time might want to argue. The student who has sat with it for a season already knows it is not an argument, but a map, and that the distress they brought with them to the teaching session can be located on that map quite precisely in the territory that was never theirs to manage. This is where Epictetus begins, not with the history of philosophy, not with the gods, not with the nature of the cosmos, though he had things to say about all of those. He begins here with this division because everything else depends on it. Every teaching he offered, every instruction he gave to students who came to him angry or frightened or exhausted by their own thinking, traces back to this single distinction. Once a person sees it clearly, not as an intellectual proposition, but as a description of how things actually are, a great deal of the labor the mind assigns itself becomes unnecessary. Not the labor of living, not the labor of caring and choosing and building a life with attention and integrity, but the specific draining labor of trying to hold things that were never ours to hold in the first place. There is a word for the part of the self that Epictetus was pointing toward. The Greeks he inherited it from had worked with the concept for generations before him, but Epictetus pressed it harder than anyone before him had, made it carry more weight, lived with it in conditions that tested it beyond any previous version. The word is prohairesis, and it does not translate easily, which is itself part of what it is pointing at. The thing it names is not quite captured by will, or choice, or character, though it contains elements of all of these. Prohairesis is the deep orientation of the self, not any single decision, but the habituated, abiding direction in which a person's assent moves. It is the faculty by which a person judges whether an impression is accurate, whether a desire is well placed, whether what appears to demand their distress actually deserves it. It is, in the most precise sense Epictetus could manage, the only thing that is genuinely and inalienably theirs. Everything outside prohairesis, the body that can be hurt, the reputation that others form, the circumstances that arrive without asking permission, belongs to a different category entirely, not an inferior category, not a shameful one, simply a different one. The body matters. Reputation has its role in a social life. Circumstances shape what is possible, but none of these are in the deepest sense one's own. They can be taken, they can be altered by forces that have nothing to do with the person they belong to. They are, in Epictetus's careful vocabulary, externals, things that can be preferred or avoided, sought or declined, but never treated as the seat of genuine well-being, without a confusion that will, in time, always find the person out. What makes this a diagnosis rather than a consolation is that it traces every form of distress back to a single source. Anger at the person who slighted a reputation, anxiety about the outcome of a plan, grief at an opportunity that did not arrive. Epictetus follows each of these back with a patience that never becomes impatient, and finds in each case the same thing at the root. Not the slight, not the uncertain outcome, not the absent opportunity, but the prior decision, usually invisible and rarely examined, to treat these things as though they were genuinely the person's to control. The distress is not a response to events. It is a response to the mismatch between what was desired and how the world moved, and the world did not cause that mismatch. The direction of the desire did. This is not a comfortable thing to hear. Epictetus knew it was not comfortable, and he did not apologize for the discomfort. A student coming to him in distress was not coming to be soothed. The student was coming, whether they knew it or not, to be shown something, to have the source of the wound located with enough precision that the wound could be addressed rather than merely dressed. Sympathy applied to a misdiagnosis leaves the patient as ill as before, only better attended. What Epictetus offered was the location of the actual wound, which required looking past the story the student had told themselves about what had happened and finding the structural mistake underneath it. The structural mistake is always the same. It is the desire aimed at something outside the self's own domain, aimed at an outcome rather than at the quality of one's engagement with a process, aimed at what others think rather than at the integrity of one's own judgments, aimed at what the world will provide rather than at what the will can genuinely offer, regardless of what the world provides. Epictetus did not say that caring about outcomes was shameful. He did not say that reputation was worthless, or that the body's comfort was beneath notice. He said something more precise and more useful than either of those things. He said that suffering arises not from what happens, but from the distance between what a person demands from events and what events are capable of reliably delivering, and that the remedy is not to care less, but to care differently, to redirect the care from the outcome to the response, from the external to the genuinely one's own, There is a field at the edge of any town in the ancient Mediterranean world, and in it a farmer has planted his crop in full expectation of the season's cooperation. He has plowed carefully. He has sowed at the right time, in the right soil, with seeds selected from his best stock. He has done everything that belongs to the domain of what is his: the attention, the labor, the judgment, the timing. Then, standing at the edge of the field one afternoon, he watches a storm arrive from the west. Not a storm he could have prevented, not a storm that chose his field deliberately, simply weather, which was always going to be weather, indifferent to his plans in the way that weather is always indifferent to everyone's plans. A Stoic farmer, and Epictetus would have recognized the type, carries already inside the act of planting a kind of internal reservation. Not a reservation about the planting, not a reluctance or a half-heartedness in the work, but a quality of relationship to the outcome that a genuinely wise farmer already possesses, built from enough seasons of watching storms arrive when they were not invited. The reservation is not resignation, it is the structural acknowledgement that the crop belongs to the domain of externals, and that the quality of the farmer's work, the integrity of the farmer's attention, belongs to a different domain entirely, one the storm cannot reach. Watching the storm from the field's edge, the wise farmer feels what he feels. Epictetus was not asking for the extinction of feeling. The crop matters. The labor that went into it matters. But underneath the feeling, steady and available, is the fact that what this farmer actually is, the quality of his attention, the character of his work, the judgment he brought to every decision in his domain, none of that is in the field. It cannot be rained upon. It cannot be flattened by hail. It persists into the next season and the one after, not diminished by what the weather chose to do. This is what Epictetus means by desire redirected rather than extinguished. The farmer does not stop caring about his crop. The student does not stop caring about their work. The person in a difficult relationship does not stop caring about the relationship. They are asked to redirect the caring from the external outcome, which was always contingent on forces outside the self, toward the quality of their own engagement, which is genuinely and permanently theirs to shape. The care becomes more precise. It finds its proper object. And in finding its proper object, it loses the specific, exhausting quality of care aimed at things that have never been equipped to respond to it reliably. Epictetus sat with a student who had been passed over for a position he had wanted, and traced the distress back through the layers of the story the student had built around the event. The position itself, external. The judgment of the person who made the decision, external. The reputation that had or had not secured the recommendation, external. The student's own anxiety about whether he deserved the position, this was closer, because it touched on judgment, which is internal. But the judgment itself, when examined, turned out to be performing a strange contortion. It was trying to locate the student's worth in the outcome of the process, rather than in the quality of the student's own preparation, intention, and character. And Epictetus, not unkindly, but without softening the point, traced the distress to exactly there, to the installation of an external outcome, as the measure of something that was never an external outcomes to measure. The student does not lose anything by this tracing, except the distress. The disappointment remains. Preferred things that do not arrive are still preferred, and not arriving is still genuinely disappointing. But the wound that goes deeper than disappointment, the wound that shakes the self because it seems to say something about the self's worth, or standing, or right to be well, that wound is not made by the event. It is made by the prior agreement to let the event be the arbiter of something it had no authority to decide. The Stoic tradition had a category for things like the position, like the crop, like the reputation that others hold of a person. The category was a diaphora, indifference, not worthless, not things to be ignored or treated with contempt, but things whose value is genuinely conditional rather than absolute, things that a rational person may prefer without treating as the foundation of the good life. Health is an indifferent, wealth is an indifferent, social standing, pleasant circumstances, even life itself, in the most precise Stoic accounting, belongs to this category. A rational person prefers health to illness and takes reasonable steps to maintain it. A rational person prefers sufficiency to poverty and works with care toward it. But no rational person, having understood the structure of things, treats health or wealth as the condition on which genuine well-being depends, because genuine well-being, in this account, cannot be located in anything the weather can reach. This is where the teaching becomes something more than a philosophical position. It becomes something that can be used, not as a formula. Epictetus was deeply suspicious of people who learned the vocabulary of philosophy without the practice of it, people who could quote the Enchiridion with precision, while their own assent moved exactly as it always had, controlled by events rather than by judgment. The teaching becomes usable only when it is inhabited rather than memorized, when the distinction between what is one's own and what is not becomes the actual operative distinction a person brings to their actual experience, rather than a concept they can produce on request. There is a particular time when this matters most, not the crises that arrive in daylight, surrounded by urgency and the proximity of other people, and the momentum of necessary action, but the long hours of the night, when the mind finds itself in the specific silence that removes all distraction and begins its habitual rehearsal. The conversation that ended badly, the remark that landed wrong, or the remark that never came. What the person across the table thought, what they said afterward, what they will think tomorrow. The plan that may not work, the outcome that cannot be known yet, and cannot be made certain now, and cannot be adjusted from a bed in a dark room at this hour. The mind rehearses these things with extraordinary diligence, as though the rehearsal were doing something, as though the careful repetition of the thing that has already happened might eventually improve it, or as though the anxious pre-experiencing of what has not yet happened might somehow prevent it. Epictetus understood what the mind was doing in these rehearsals, though he would not have called it rumination. He would have called it a misapplication of the ruling faculty, the rational capacity for judgment, being turned not toward its proper work of examining one's own assents and responses, but outward toward a territory it cannot manage, measuring and adjusting and attempting to govern things that were never within its jurisdiction. The labor is real, the effort is genuine, but it is effort aimed at a domain that does not respond to it, which is what makes the labor so exhausting and the night so long. The question Epictetus offers to this kind of work is not a rhetorical weapon or an attempt to shame the mind out of its patterns. It is a genuine diagnostic question, the same question he brought to every student who arrived at his door with their distress. Of all these things the mind is turning over, the conversation, the reputation, the outcome, the judgment someone else is forming right now in a room the mind cannot enter, which of these is genuinely mine? Not mine in the sense of concerning me or mattering to me, but mine in the sense of belonging to my domain, being answerable to my will, being constituted by my judgment rather than by forces outside it. The conversation that has already ended, external. What was said was said. The words belong now to the past, which is a region more thoroughly outside one's domain than the future, because the future at least still contains some portion of the genuine present. The remark that landed wrong, the landing belongs to the other person's impression, which is external, at what one intended, how one spoke, from one's own genuine understanding and care. This belongs to the domain of what is genuinely one's own, and it can be examined and learned from, and that examination is proper work. But the impression as it was received, and what is being thought about it now in that other room, this is not territory the mind can enter, manage, or improve by replaying the scene at midnight. The outcome of the plan, this contains a portion that is genuinely one's own. The quality of the preparation, the integrity of the judgment that shaped the plan, the care brought to the execution. All of this is genuine domain, but the outcome itself, the way the world will arrange itself in response to the plan, the decisions other people will make, the circumstances that will arrive, these are external, and the mind that rehearses the possible outcomes at night is not planning, it is worrying, which is the specific activity of applying the ruling faculty to a domain where it cannot find purchase, where there is no soil for its work to take root in, where all the energy it brings converts not into preparation, but into the simple circular labor of returning again and again to a question that the night cannot answer. The question that the night can always answer, regardless of what is happening, regardless of what the day brought or what the tomorrow holds, is a different question. Not what will happen, but how does this self, this proheres, this seat of genuine agency, wish to meet whatever comes? Not a passive question, not a resignation, a genuinely active one, because the quality of one's response, the care brought to it, the integrity preserved in it, the attention given to it, regardless of the outcome it produces, this is the work that is always available, always fully within reach, with never contingent on whether the world arranges itself helpfully or not. Epictetus came to this teaching from a position that made it impossible to claim without testing it personally. He was not someone who had considered the theory of external indifference from the comfort of sufficient circumstances and decided it made philosophical sense. He had lived the version of the teaching in which the externals were reduced to nothing, no legal standing, no property, no formal protection, no claim on his own body that another person was bound to respect, and the teaching still held. Not as consolation, not as a story he told himself to make an unbearable situation bearable, as an accurate description of what he found when he looked honestly at what remained in the only domain that was always his, the quality of his own assent, the direction of his own judgment, the moral character he chose to inhabit, regardless of what surrounded it. This is what gives the first sentence of the Enchiridion its particular weight. Some things are up to us. When Epictetus says this, the claim carries the authority not of a philosopher who has reasoned toward a conclusion and found it persuasive, but of a person who has lived the claim in the only conditions that could fully test it. The teaching is not borrowed. It did not arrive in his life as received wisdom that he found intellectually compelling and passed along. It is something he found, not as a discovery in the sense of a sudden seeing, but as something tested, tried against the actual conditions of his actual life, and found to hold. The person lying awake in the night is not in the conditions that tested Epictetus. This matters, but it also matters less than it might seem, because the structure of the teaching does not depend on the extremity of the circumstances. The mismatch between desire and its object is present in ordinary anxiety as fully as in extraordinary suffering. The misapplication of the ruling faculty, turning it outward toward what cannot be managed, rather than inward toward what genuinely can, is the same structural mistake, whether the circumstance is small or large. And the relief that comes from identifying the mistake and correcting the direction of attention is the same relief, proportionate in scale, but identical in nature. A person traces their anxiety back through the night's rehearsal, the conversation replayed, external in the relevant sense, the other person's impression no longer reachable, the reputation in question, external, constituted in someone else's judgment, not available for revision from this bed, the outcome feared, external, dependent on conditions not yet arrived, not manageable from here, the person's own response to whatever comes. This is the genuine domain. This is the question that the night can answer because it does not depend on anything the night is withholding. And the question, held quietly rather than pressed urgently, begins to change what the night feels like. Not because it solves the problems the mind was turning over. The conversation still happened. The outcome is still uncertain. The reputation still exists in other people's minds, formed from their own impressions and their own assents. None of this is resolved by the question, but the mind's relationship to these things changes when the question locates them in their correct domain. What was presented as a problem to be solved, a thing the mind could, if it worked hard enough, finally arrange correctly, reveals itself to be something else. Not a problem, a condition. The conditions of a life lived in a world that does not conform itself to wishes, where outcomes are shared between one's own efforts and forces larger than any individual effort, where other people have their own impressions and a sense that belong entirely to them. In this light, the mind's labor has been aimed at managing conditions, and the Stoic recognition is not that conditions do not matter, or that caring about them is a philosophical failing. It is that conditions are not the work. The work is always the self's response to conditions, which is always available, always genuinely one's own, always present, regardless of what the conditions are doing. Epictetus described a student who came to him distressed by public criticism, the specific, exposed distress of someone who had spoken their view and been mocked for it, and who had arrived at the teacher's door carrying both the mockery and the question of what to do with it. Epictetus traced the wound back carefully. The mockery itself, what was it made of? Words, spoken in a room by a person whose own assent had produced them. The words moved through air and arrived as sounds. Between those sounds and the wound there was a gap, and in that gap there was something that belonged to the student, a judgment, an assent, a decision to treat the words as authoritative, to install the mocker's opinion as a measure of something genuine. The words did not make the wound. The student's assent to the word's authority made the wound, which means the authority was never in the words at all. It was always in the student's own judgment, which is the only place authority ever actually lives. This is not a denial of the mockery. It is not a claim that the words did not land, or that their landing was pleasant. It is a precise tracing of the causal structure of the experience, which reveals that the element of the experience that actually has the power to harm, the element that constitutes the wound, rather than merely its occasion, is not the mocker's. It is the student's own, which means it is within the student's domain, which means it is something the student can work with, address, examine, and gradually, with practice, redirect. The student sits with this for a moment. The teaching does not arrive all at once. Epictetus knew this, and he did not rush the sitting. The moment of sitting with it is already the practice, the ruling faculty turning toward its own assents, examining the structure of its own distress, rather than the content of the situation that seemed to cause it. This is the practice, not a dramatic reorientation, not a sudden conversion to a different way of being, just the slight but genuine shift of attention from what happened to what I assented to, from the condition to my relationship with it, from the domain that was never mine to the one that always has been. The night settles around this shift. The mind, which has been turning the world over with great energy and no purchase, finds something it can actually hold, not the outcome, not the impression, not the reputation, or the circumstance, or the remark that was or was not made, but the quality of its own assent to whatever comes, the direction of its own caring, the integrity of its own response, the character it has been building through every previous decision about where to place its attention and to what end. This is a small thing. Epictetus would not have called it small. He would have said it was the only thing, the single thing that is fully and permanently one's own. But held in the quiet of a long night, it does not feel like a grand claim. It feels like a hand opening, releasing a long list of objects that were never sized for that hand, never meant to be carried this way, never available for the kind of holding that was being attempted. The hand opens. The list of what needs managing, adjusting, revising, and rehearsing releases into the dark where it belongs, not because it doesn't matter, not because the morning will not bring it back. It may, but because this is not the domain in which it can be worked. This is not the hour for the management of externals, which were never fully manageable in any hour. What remains when the list has been released is quieter than the release itself. It is not emptiness. There is a difference between the quiet of a mind that has abandoned its work and the quiet of a mind that has found its actual work and recognized that, for this hour, the actual work is simply to rest. The ruling faculty, turned toward its own domain rather than outward toward what it cannot reach, finds that the domain is already intact. The character that has been building, ascent by ascent, through every careful choice about where to place attention, this did not require the night's rehearsal to remain in place. It was already here. It will be here in the morning. The conversation that went wrong did not dismantle it. The uncertain outcome does not threaten it. The opinion forming in another person's mind, which was always beyond the reach of this hand, was never its measure in the first place. Epictetus said some things are up to us. He said it first, before anything else, because he knew that a person who has genuinely heard this and genuinely sat with it for long enough no longer needs to arrange the night around the management of what is not. The night becomes available for something simpler, not for a practice, not for a philosophy, not for a discipline that requires work, for rest, which is what the body asks for, and what the mind, when it has finally released the labor it was never equipped to do, also asks for, in its own way, in its own quiet, at the end of a long day of living in a world that was always partly theirs and partly not, and that will still be there, as it has always been, when the morning comes. The hand opens, the carrying stops. What was always one's own remains, without effort, without rehearsal, without the long night's accounting of what cannot be revised from here. It remains the way it always has, patient, unhurried, indifferent to the hour, as available at the end of the night as at any other moment, asking nothing, requiring only the attention that was already there and needed only to be, at last turned home. A merchant stands at the edge of the Athenian agora in the early morning, and everything he owned is gone, not misplaced, not temporarily unavailable, gone in the way that only water can take things, completely, without apology, and with no interest in what they were worth to the man who had been carrying them. His ship had foundered somewhere between Phoenicia and the port at Piraeus, and the cargo that was his livelihood, the material substance of his commercial life, was distributed now across the floor of a sea that did not know his name. He stood in Athens as a man stripped to the bare fact of himself, and what he did next, this Phoenician Greek merchant named Zeno of Citium was walk into a bookshop. The bookshop was near the agora, and someone inside was reading aloud from a text about Socrates. Zeno listened. He asked where he might find men like the ones being described. A philosopher happened to be walking past at that moment. The story has always had this quality, this sense of coincidence that feels less like luck and more like a form of readiness being met, and Zeno followed him. He began to study. He began to ask questions of the sort that had no commercial value and no obvious destination, the kind of questions that stay open for decades and do not diminish for the staying. Some years later, when he had thought long enough and carefully enough to feel something worth saying, he began to say it. And the place he chose to say it was a public colonnade near the agora called the Stoa Poikila, the painted porch, decorated along its walls with large murals of famous battles, open on all sides to the noise and weather of the city, a thoroughfare as much as an architecture, a place where anyone who happened to be walking past might slow their step and hear a man talking carefully about how to live. The school took its name from that colonnade, not from a principal, not from its founder's name, but from a covered walkway in Athens that could not keep the wind out. There is something in that, a philosophy named for a porch, a building that is not quite a building, a shelter open to the same world it is trying to help the philosopher navigate. The Stoics did not begin in a private academy behind closed doors, among students who had been vetted and admitted. They began in a public space, available to anyone who passed and paused, and this fact carried forward into the character of everything that followed. A philosophy conducted not in withdrawal from the world, but inside it, under the same sky, subject to the same interruptions. Zeno taught at the Stoa Poike for decades. He gathered students. He argued. He refined. After him came Cleanthes, who had been a boxer before he was a philosopher, and who maintained his athletic habits throughout his philosophical life, rising before dawn, working through the night, reportedly hauling water to pay for his own instruction, as if the body's discipline and the mind's were not separate things. Cleanthes wrote a hymn to Zeus that was really a hymn to the rational order of everything, a piece of writing so carefully made that it survived long enough to be read by people who did not believe in Zeus at all, and found it still worth reading. After Cleanthes came the man who would do more than anyone else to make Stoicism a systematic philosophy capable of being transmitted across centuries. Chrysippus of Soli was born in what is now southern Turkey, came to Athens, and began to write. He wrote about logic, about language, about the physics of the universe and the ethics of living in it, and he wrote with a thoroughness that ancient sources described as almost incomprehensible in its quantity. The texts themselves did not survive, almost none of them in any complete form, but the school did, in a way that made later philosophers reach for a particular saying. Without Chrysippus, there would be no Stoic school, not because the ideas were only his, but because he had articulated them with enough precision and enough rigor that they could be passed on, examined, contested, and built upon. He took what Zeno had begun in the open air of the colonnade and gave it the internal architecture it needed to stand for centuries without its founder present to explain it. What Chrysippus formalized was, among other things, an account of the universe that placed reason at its center in a very particular way, not as a human achievement standing apart from a mindless world, but as the very substance of the world itself, present in matter, present in the growth of plants toward light, present most fully and deliberately in the capacity of the human mind to step back from its own first impressions and ask whether they are accurate. The Stoics called this the logos, the rational principle that was not a god looking down on the universe from outside, but the organizing intelligence moving through everything from within, making stone dense, making fire hot, making the human animal capable of the specific peculiar act of examining its own thinking. This was not an abstract idea for the people who held it. It had consequences that reached into the smallest details of daily life. If the rational order of things is the universe's own nature, then resistance to what happens is not just painful, it is a kind of philosophical self-contradiction, a mind arguing with the very intelligence it is made of. To rail against circumstances was in this account to be at war with reason itself, which is the one thing the Stoic tradition was trying to move toward rather than away from. Living according to reason and living in accord with nature were the same instruction. The logos made them identical, and this meant that for a Stoic philosopher, the question of how to live was never entirely separate from the question of what the world fundamentally is. Chrysippus also worked out an account of how human beings naturally develop their relationships to the world around them. He had a word for it, oikeiosis, which described something like the natural affinity a creature has for itself, for its own continued existence and well-being, and then, as the creature develops, the extending outward of that affinity to include others, family, community, and in the widest Stoic account, all rational beings, everywhere. This was not a sentimental instruction, it was a structural claim about the nature of reason. If reason is what all human beings share, and if reason is what each human being most essentially is, then the recognition of another rational being is, in a precise sense, a recognition of something that belongs to the same whole. The Stoics were among the earliest thinkers in the ancient world to argue, on philosophical grounds, for a form of solidarity that did not depend on shared citizenship, shared ancestry, or shared religion. The grounds were more abstract, and for that reason more durable, the shared possession of a rational nature, embedded in a universe whose own deepest nature was rational. This is the tradition that was alive and long established when a boy was born in a small city in what is now Western Turkey in the 1st century of the Common Era, in a city called Hierapolis, on the edge of the Greek-speaking world. He was given no particular name of his own. He was given the word that meant he had been acquired. He arrived in Rome as a piece of property, and what he carried into the city was a capacity for attention and a willingness to think, which the philosophical tradition he was about to encounter would eventually argue were the only things any human being truly owned. The Roman world into which Stoicism moved was different from the Athenian world in which it had begun. Rome was a city of ambition performed publicly, of reputations maintained at enormous personal cost, of men who spent their lives arranging for the opinions of others. It was also a city in which the Stoic emphasis on virtue, on reason, on the independence of the inner life from external fortune had found a particular resonance, perhaps because the stakes of external fortune in Rome were so spectacularly high, the falls so ruinous, the distances between favor and disgrace so short and so suddenly traversable. A philosophy that located genuine well-being somewhere other than in the approval of powerful men had a special utility in a city governed by the moods of emperors. Seneca was among the first to make this utility explicit and accessible. He wrote in the 1st century of the Common Era, the same decades in which Epictetus was learning to think, and what he wrote was not primarily systematic philosophy in the mode of Chrysippus. It was counsel. It was letters to a friend, essays addressed to real people with real problems, philosophical writing that did not keep its distance from the texture of daily life. He wrote about time, about how most of it passed without being properly inhabited, how the hours accumulated into days, and the days into years, and the years into a life that had somehow been spent on arrangements rather than on living. He had a particular way of pressing this observation into the reader's present moment, a quiet urgency, as though he had just noticed how late it was and wanted to make sure the person he was writing to had also looked up at the light. His essay on the shortness of life made an argument that might have seemed counterintuitive coming from a Stoic philosopher. Life, he said, is not actually short. It only seems short because so much of it is surrendered to distraction, to the management of impressions, to the pursuit of things that do not, when obtained, deliver what they promised. The person who has spent 40 years arranging to be respected by people whose respect does not nourish anything genuine has not lived 40 years. Seneca argued they have merely aged through 40 years, which is a different thing. The philosophical life was not an addition to ordinary life, but its recovery, the reclaiming of hours and attention from the machinery of social performance, and redirecting them toward what was actually, in Stoic terms, worth wanting. Seneca was a complicated figure. He was wealthy, at times politically powerful, working out a Stoic philosophy in conditions of material comfort that made some of his contemporaries skeptical. He knew the skepticism existed, and he addressed it directly, which is itself a Stoic gesture, the willingness to look honestly at the gap between what one teaches and what one lives, and to treat the gap not as hypocrisy to be concealed, but as a philosophical problem to be kept in view. He did not claim to have achieved Stoic wisdom. He claimed to be trying, and to find that the trying was worth something even when the achieving remained incomplete. This distinction mattered to him, and it mattered to the people who read him across the following 20 centuries, who found in his letters the particular comfort of a philosopher who was not performing serenity, but working toward it in full view of his own shortcomings. The letters he wrote to his friend Lucilius have a quality that is hard to find in more systematic philosophical texts. They breathe. They move from a specific observation, a crowd in the street, the noise from the baths below his window, the way a morning can be lost before it has properly begun, to a philosophical claim, and then back to the specific, and the movement is so practiced and so natural that the argument never loses the warmth of the particular moment it arose from. Lucilius was real, and Seneca was writing to a real person in real time, and something of that realness carries through the centuries and arrives intact. The letters feel sent, not preserved. They feel like they are still in transit, reaching towards someone in the specific trouble of being alive. And then there was Marcus Aurelius, and the private notebook he kept in Greek during military campaigns on the northern frontier of the empire. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world, nominally. He commanded legions, administered an empire that extended from Scotland to Mesopotamia, and made decisions every day that affected the lives of millions of people who did not know his name. And in the evenings, alone with a lamp and a notebook, he wrote to himself in the language of his philosophical education, Greek, the language of Epictetus, the language of the tradition he was trying to apply to the conditions of ruling an empire during a period of plague and war. And what he wrote was not strategy, not policy, not the record of a powerful man accounting for his power. It was a series of reminders. He reminded himself about the ruling faculty, the inner center of rational judgment that could not be compelled by any external authority. He reminded himself that the obstacle on the path did not prevent the path, but was itself available to be turned toward, incorporated, used. He reminded himself again and again about what Epictetus had taught, that some things are within one's authority and some things are entirely outside it, and that the entire question of how to live comes down to knowing which is which and refusing to confuse them. He wrote this to himself because he needed to be reminded. He did not write it as a man who had mastered these distinctions and was recording his mastery for posterity. He wrote it as a man who kept forgetting, in the press of daily circumstances, what mattered most, and who returned, in the evenings, to the philosophical framework that helped him remember. The notebook was private. He did not intend it to be read. There is no evidence he ever revised it with an audience in mind, no editorial gesture toward a reader who was not himself. And this is precisely what makes the meditations carry the weight they carry across the centuries, not the authority of a teacher composing lessons, but the transparency of a student who happens also to be an emperor, writing down what he needs to hear late at night in a language that keeps him connected to the tradition he is trying to inhabit. Philosophy traveling not from master to crowd, but from one moment of a single, struggling mind to the next. Marcus did not invent what he was writing about. He acknowledged repeatedly his debts to his teachers, to Epictetus above all, to the long tradition he had received. He was not trying to be original. He was trying to be adequate to what he had been given, and in this way the meditations form with the Enchiridion, a kind of diptych, one the distilled record of a teacher who trained others in Nicopolis, the other the private journal of a student who happened to reign over an empire, both reaching for the same understanding and finding it, each in their own way, partially and imperfectly, and with genuine effort, which is the only way the understanding was ever reached. What carries through both documents, and through the letters of Seneca, and through the reconstructed logic of Chrysippus, and back to Zeno standing in Athens with his cargo at the bottom of the sea, is something that was not invented by any of them. They were reaching for a pattern in the structure of experience that does not belong to any single person or century. The pattern is this: the mind that has placed the weight of its well-being on things outside its own authority has made itself hostage to the indifference of the world. And the world is genuinely indifferent, not malicious, not punishing, simply occupied with being what it is, without particular reference to what any individual wants it to be. And the liberation from this hostage condition is not the acquisition of power over circumstance, because that power is never fully available, and its pursuit consumes a life. The liberation is the recognition that something was never at stake that was thought to be at stake. The recognition that what the self most essentially is has never been in the world's jurisdiction. This is not a comfortable idea the first time it arrives. It has the quality of something that looks from a distance, like resignation, like a philosophy that counsels the prisoner to love the cell. The Stoics knew this objection and answered it in a particular way, by insisting on the distinction between the things worth wanting and the things that, when examined, turn out to have been preferences mistaken for necessities. It is reasonable to prefer health to illness, freedom to confinement, friendship to isolation. The Stoic does not pretend otherwise. But there is a difference between a reasonable preference, I would rather have warmth than cold, and I will take sensible steps toward warmth, and a philosophical dependency in which warmth becomes the condition of one's peace, rather than a comfortable feature of one's circumstances. The first is wisdom, the second is vulnerability of a very specific, and in Stoic terms entirely unnecessary kind. Chrysippus had worked this distinction out with considerable precision, and it entered the tradition as a technical category. The word was a diaphora, things that are, in the deepest sense, philosophically indifferent, not because they are unimportant in daily life, but because they are not the ground of genuine human well-being. A rational person selects among the indifferents those that are naturally preferred: health, adequate material provision, the company of people one loves, and pursues them with full engagement and sensible effort. But the pursuit is conducted with a quiet internal reservation, a knowledge that the outcome is not entirely within the pursuer's authority, and that the self's real standing does not hang on the result. The reservation does not diminish the effort. It protects the person from a very specific kind of wreckage, the wreckage that follows when something genuinely valued is not obtained, or is obtained and then lost, and the person had staked more than was wise on receiving and keeping it. This is not in the end a teaching about detachment in any cold or distancing sense. The Stoics loved their families. Epictetus, who had no children of his own by nature, reportedly raised an abandoned child. Marcus Aurelius wrote with evident feeling about his friends, his wife, his teachers. Seneca's letters to Lucilius are saturated with the warmth of genuine affection. The tradition did not counsel the extinction of love or care. It counseled a particular relationship to the things loved, a relationship in which love is held fully and given freely, but the beloved is not installed as the foundation of the self-stability, because the beloved is in some future subject to loss, not cynically, not coldly, just honestly. And the honesty in Stoic practice was not a preparation for loss so much as a liberation into presence, the capacity to love the thing in front of one without the shadow of anxiety about its eventual absence falling across the experience of loving it now. The tradition moved through Rome and through the centuries that followed with a persistence that had nothing to do with institutional support or official endorsement. Stoic schools rose and declined. Texts were lost, partial, reconstructed from quotations in other texts. Chrysippus's own writing survived almost entirely in fragments and references. What carried forward was not a library, but something harder to preserve and harder to destroy, a way of asking the central question, a diagnostic structure that could be applied to any experience of suffering and find, in almost every case, the same root. The question was not what had happened, but where the pain was actually located. And the answer, arrived at again and again across the centuries, was the same in the mismatch between what had been wanted and what the world had delivered, a mismatch that lived entirely in the relationship between the wanting and the world, not in the world itself. There is a quality to these texts when they are read late at night, which is the condition in which they have probably most often been read across the centuries. Something about the hour makes the philosophy accessible in a way that the middle of a busy day does not quite permit. In the middle of the day, the Stoic distinctions can seem obvious. Of course, what matters most is how one responds, not what happens. Of course, the opinion of a stranger is not the foundation of one's dignity. But at night, when the mind is less defended, when the day's accumulation of small defeats and unresolved difficulties presses in, the obvious distinction becomes harder to hold, and what is needed is not a novel argument, but a return to one. The meditations were written for exactly this hour, and they work in this hour in a way they work nowhere else, not as instruction, but as company, the specific company of a man who was trying in the dark to remember what he knew. Seneca knew this hour too, and wrote for it. His letters move in their best passages with the slowness of a mind at rest, thinking through something that has been with it for a long time. They do not hurry. They do not perform certainty. They arrive at their conclusions the way a person arrives at a familiar room, not surprised to find it there, not needing to announce the arrival, simply settling into the space that has been waiting. And Zeno's Stoa Poikla, the open-sided colonnade where all of this began, was also a space that did not enclose. It stood open to the agora and the sky, and the philosopher spoke within it to whoever slowed their pace long enough to hear. This is the image the tradition returns to when it is honest about what it was and what it was for. Not a closed school for the specially prepared, but a covered walkway in a busy city where a man who had lost everything began to articulate what could not be lost. The painted battles on the walls behind him showed victories and defeats, armies and the aftermath of armies, the great churn of external fortune that the tradition he was founding would spend 400 years learning to stand calmly inside of. Outside, the agora continued its ordinary business, the buying and selling, the arguments, the social performance, and Zeno spoke, and some of the people who slowed their pace stayed and brought others, and the conversation continued in a direction none of them could have anticipated. It continued through Cleanthes hauling water in the pre-dawn dark, through Chrysippus writing in Athens, decade after decade, building with words and architecture that the words themselves would not survive, through Musonius Rufus teaching whoever came to him, regardless of their legal standing, through a boy from Hierapolis arriving in Rome with nothing he could name as his own, and discovering in a philosophical tradition older than he was a precise description of what could not be taken from him, through Seneca writing to Lucilius about how the morning was already half gone before either of them had turned to face it properly, through Marcus alone in a tent on the Danube frontier, writing in Greek to himself by lamplight, reminding himself of what he kept needing to be reminded of, because the reminders were not insults to his intelligence, but acknowledgments of the difficulty, the genuine, daily recurring difficulty of living in accordance with what one knows. The notebook was never meant to last. It was a set of working notes for a life still in progress, written in a language the writer had studied out of love for a tradition, in conditions that made that tradition hard to practice, by a man who considered himself a student still. And that is exactly what preserved it, not its polish, not its authority, but its honesty, its quality of a mind still in motion, still returning to the same questions, and finding them still open, still worth returning to. The lamp in the tent eventually went out. The frontier eventually moved. The empire that Marcus ruled eventually became something else, and then something else again, and the Greek he wrote in became a language that required scholars to read. But the notebook remained, and was copied, and was carried forward in the attentive hands of people who found in it something they recognized, not a foreign philosophy belonging to a past civilization, but a description of an experience they knew from the inside, an account of what it is to sit with the full weight of one's circumstances and find, at the center of that sitting, something that the circumstances had not touched. This is how the tradition traveled, not through the survival of complete libraries or the continuity of institutions, but through the particular act of one person reading something in a quiet moment and finding it accurate to the experience of lying awake when the world outside is pressing in, accurate to the experience of having wanted something that was not given or having lost something that was held, accurate to the experience of asking, in the dark, what of all this belongs to the domain of what is genuinely one's own, and finding that the question, however old it is, arrives each time as if new, because the asking is always happening now, in the actual hour of the person asking. Zeno's cargo was gone. He stood in Athens with the bare fact of himself, and what he found there, in the philosopher's conversation, was a tradition waiting to articulate what he was already, in some inarticulate form, living, that the loss was real, and the life was not over, and the self that stood on the Athenian morning was intact in the way that mattered most, carrying something that no sea could distribute across its floor. That discovery became a school. The school became a text. The text was copied into other texts, and traveled, and arrived in places its authors had not imagined and could not have named. It arrived in the hands of people who needed it in specific private ways that no philosopher ever fully anticipates when they begin to speak. It arrived in a tent on the Danube, in a lamplit room in Rome, in a teaching space in Nicopolis, where a teacher who had been someone else's property stood before students and said, with complete authority, what could not be taken and what had never needed to be given because it was already there. Marcus wrote by lamplight in the dark in Greek. To himself, the stylus moved, the letters formed, the notebook filled, slowly, with the record of a man who kept coming back to the same questions because the questions were worth keeping. Outside, the frontier held for another day, or did not hold, and the morning would come with its new set of circumstances, and he would return to the notebook, because the notebook was where he found the part of himself that circumstances did not govern. The lamp threw its small circle of light on the page. The rest of the tent was dark, and in that small circle the tradition went on, not to any destination, not toward any final answer, but steadily, patiently, in the way that a fire in a sheltered place goes on, through a long night, fed carefully, tended honestly, giving just enough light to see by. Epictetus paused before answering. That pause is worth staying with for a moment. The student across from him flushed, his shoulders tight with the particular humiliation of having been passed over for something he had wanted openly and lost publicly, and Epictetus simply waited, not to gather his thoughts, not because the answer was difficult. The pause was already the beginning of the teaching, the way a good physician lets a patient speak until the real complaint surfaces beneath the presenting one. The student had been eligible for an appointment, a civic honor of the kind that Rome distributed among men of a certain standing. Another man had received it. The slight was real, the disappointment genuine, and now here he was in Nicopolis, in the small school that Epictetus ran without fanfare, sitting across from a man who had been someone's property and asking, in the particular anguish of someone who believes the world has wronged him, what he was supposed to do with this feeling. Epictetus looked at him for a moment with the settled attention of someone who has heard this complaint before, not this exact one, but the structure of it, the architecture of a mind that has located its peace in something that does not belong to it. Then he began, not with doctrine, not with the vocabulary of Stoic philosophy laid out in its technical precision. He began with a question so simple it could almost be missed. He asked the student what exactly had been taken from him. The student started to answer, the honor, the recognition, the position, and Epictetus asked him to look more carefully. Was the honor his before it was conferred? Was it his to begin with? Or had it always been something that others held, others evaluated, and others distributed according to their own criteria, which were not his to control and had never been his to set? The student sat with this, which is the right amount of time to begin to feel something as true, rather than merely hearing it stated. There is a word in Epictetus's Greek that does not translate with the ease one might want. Prohairesis. It names the seat of character, the deep faculty of rational choice and moral assent, not the individual decisions a person makes moment to moment, but the abiding orientation of a self toward what it values, what it pursues, what it allows to mean something. Everything that flows from this faculty, the quality of a person's attention, the honesty of their judgments, the steadiness of their responses, belongs entirely to the person who holds it. Everything outside this faculty, including honors, appointments, the opinions of Roman officials, and the evaluations of other people's merit, belongs to the general category of things that move according to forces other than one's own will. The student wanted the honor. That wanting was his. The honor itself never was. This is where the student's distress had its source. Epictetus said, not in being passed over, because being passed over is a fact about the world's distribution of things that were never the student's to control, but in the prior judgment that the honor was necessary, that its absence was a genuine wound to something real and essential. The wound was self-administered, not in the sense that the student had been careless, but in the precise sense that he had extended his conception of himself out into territory that was never securely his, and the world had moved, as the world does, indifferently. This does not mean it is wrong to want an honor. Epictetus was not counseling the extinction of preference. He was a practical teacher of enormous specificity, not a theorist of emotional suppression. A Stoic may prefer recognition to obscurity, health to illness, company to solitude. These preferences are natural and need not be argued away. What must be re-examined is the weight placed on them, whether the peace of a life rests on receiving them, whether the absence of what is preferred constitutes a genuine harm to the person whose preferences were not met. The student, sitting in the morning light of a school in Nicopolis, was beginning to feel his way toward a distinction that would take longer to inhabit than to understand. Understanding arrives quickly. Inhabiting takes time and daily practice, and the particular kind of patience that comes from returning to the same principle through different circumstances until its truth is not a thought, but a posture. There is an image Epictetus used more than once in the discourses that appears deceptively simple. He compared the life of a philosophical practitioner to the role of an actor in a play. The author of the play decides the roles. One person is cast as a servant, another as a king, another as the philosopher wandering the margins of a civic comedy. None of them chose their assignment. The actor who is given the role of a poor man does not get to negotiate with the playwright for a more prestigious part. The playwright is not consulted on the matter of the actor's preference, but the merit of the performance, the presence, the genuine inhabitation of the character, the quality of attention brought to even the smallest line belongs entirely to the actor. The actor who plays a servant with full commitment and real craft is performing something categorically different from the actor who plays a king with resentment and distraction. The audience feels this difference. More importantly, the actor feels it. The role assigned is not the measure of a life. The quality of inhabitation is alone. In Rome, a theater of this kind was a familiar social reality. The roles were assigned at birth, by family, by citizenship, by the accident of who owned whom in a system of enslaved labor that moved human beings across cities without consultation. Epictetus had been assigned a role he did not choose. He had played it. He had eventually moved beyond it in legal terms when he received his freedom. But the philosophical teaching had not waited for his freedom to become true. It had been available in the midst of everything, as a way of orienting oneself toward the quality of one's own responses, when everything else was arranged by someone else's authority. The theatrical metaphor is not consolation. Precisely, it does not soften the weight of an unchosen circumstance, or pretend that all roles are equally comfortable to inhabit. What it does is locate the question of merit in the one domain where it is genuinely answerable, not what has been given, but what has been made of what has been given. The space between an assigned condition and the quality of attention brought to it is the only space in Epictetan terms that fully belongs to the person living in it. And that space is not small. It is, in the most precise philosophical sense, everything. There is a second teaching from the discourses that lives alongside the theatrical metaphor with such quiet usefulness that it deserves its own consideration. Epictetus taught a practice for which the Greek term is hupexeresis, a word composed of parts that means something like reservation or withdrawal before the fact, a prior step back built into the act of commitment itself. The practice is this: when a person undertakes any action directed at a result in a world whose circumstances are not fully under their control, they engage with that action fully and sincerely, planning carefully, working attentively, caring genuinely about the outcome, and they carry inside that engagement a quiet reservation, an internal acknowledgement that the outcome may be interrupted by circumstances that have nothing to do with the quality of their effort. A person boards a ship for a long voyage. They have planned the journey with care. They have arranged for what they need. The destination is real. The intention is genuine. The preparations are thorough. And they carry, somewhere beneath all of this, a quiet acknowledgement that the weather belongs to the sea, that the port's availability belongs to the port, that the journey may become something other than what was planned, not because the planning was wrong, but because the world contains forces that planning cannot preempt. The reservation does not diminish the planning. It is not a counsel of half-heartedness. It does not tell the traveler to care less about the destination, to pack with less attention, to say goodbye to those on the dock with less warmth. It tells them to notice the distinction already present in any wise traveler's relationship to weather, between caring about an outcome and owning it, between genuine commitment and the insistence that reality arrange itself according to one's investment. The ancient Stoics sometimes framed this with the image of an archer. The archer draws back the string, sights the target, releases everything within the archer's domain: the angle of the bow, the tension of the string, the stillness of the breath, the training accumulated across years, is given fully to the shot. Then the arrow is in the air, and the arrow is no longer the archer's. A gust of wind, an imperfection in the shaft, the slight variation of distance that cannot be calculated precisely, these belong to the world's domain, not the archer's. The archer of sound philosophical character has already made, somewhere in the act of releasing, the internal acknowledgement that the arrow's flight is no longer theirs to command. This is not a comfortable thought to hold if it is not yet familiar. It requires practice, because the mind trained by ordinary habit wants to hold the arrow's trajectory as its own, wants to follow the investment all the way to the target, wants the outcome to be the measure of the effort. The Stoic instruction is not that the outcome does not matter. It is that the measure of the effort belongs elsewhere, in the quality of the draw, the steadiness of the aim, the accumulated discipline of the training, and that locating the measure there, rather than in the landing, is what protects the archer's equanimity when the wind intervenes. Hupaxer does not produce indifference. It produces the specific and hard-won steadiness of someone who has separated the domain of their genuine agency from the domain of the world's independent movement, and who meets the results of that movement, whether favorable or not, from a grounded position rather than a position of shock and exposure. A student of Epictetus who has genuinely practiced this will still feel disappointment when a journey goes wrong. Epictetus did not teach that feelings were philosophically incorrect. He taught that the second movement, the judgment that the feeling reflects a genuine harm to something real and essential, is where the practitioner has work to do. The disappointment passes through. The judgment is the thing that takes root, and grows into suffering, and the judgment is where prohersal lives, and where the work of philosophy is done. At the center of the Enchiridion, in language so precise it could almost be read as an instruction for assembly, Epictetus addressed what happens when another person speaks unkindly, when a person is mocked in public, insulted in private, dismissed with contempt, or spoken of in terms designed to diminish them. These are not uncommon experiences. They happen in the course of an ordinary life, with a frequency that makes them, in the aggregate, one of the more reliable sources of sustained distress. Epictetus sat with a student who had just been publicly mocked. The details are not important. It is enough to know that the mockery was sharp, and the setting was social, and the student felt the wound in the particular way that public wounds are felt, with the extra dimension of being seen to have been wounded, which compounds the injury. Epictetus asked him to locate the injury precisely. Where was it? Exactly. What had been damaged? The student began. His reputation, the sense that others now thought less of him, the loss of a standing he had worked to establish. Epictetus followed each of these back to its source. Reputation is the aggregate of other people's opinions. Opinions belong to the people holding them and cannot be entered or altered by the person being evaluated. A reputation, then, is not something a person possesses in any secure sense. It is something attributed, revised, held and withdrawn by others according to their own processes, which are not under the control of the person being assessed. The standing that the student felt he had lost, where had that standing resided before the mockery? In the opinions of the people who were now revising them, which means the standing was always on loan, always conditional, always one public remark away from revision. It was never in the most precise philosophical sense his. The bruise, Epictetus said, was not applied by the words. Words are, in the most literal sense, sound, vibrations of air, shaped by another person's will and intention, arriving at the listener's ears and stopping. What they cannot do, by their own nature, is reach inside the listener and alter the faculty of rational judgment, the quality of moral character, the steadiness of the philosophical orientation. Those things require the listener's own participation. The bruise was applied by the student's decision to treat the words as authoritative, by the prior judgment installed long before the mockery occurred, that other people's assessments of him were valid measures of his actual standing, that their contempt could diminish something real and essential, that the words had the power to do what they appeared to have done. This is not a comfortable finding. It does not soften the sharpness of the moment, but it is, in Epictetan terms, genuinely useful in the way that a precise diagnosis is more useful than a comforting misdiagnosis, because it locates the source of the distress in the domain where the practitioner has actual authority to work, rather than in the domain other people's opinions, where no amount of labor will produce a stable result. The student sat with this for a moment. A moment is the right amount of time, long enough to feel the shape of it. There is a formulation from the Enchiridion that arrives with the quiet weight of something entirely honest. On the subject of loss, of things and of people, of circumstances that were present and are now absent, Epictetus writes, "Never say of anything, I have lost it, but say instead, I have returned it. Of a person, not, my child has died, but my child has been returned. Of a possession, not, I have lost it, but I have given it back." This formulation is often misread as instruction to suppress grief. It is the opposite. It begins from the acknowledgement that love is real, that attachment is genuine, that the loss of what is loved is felt and should be felt. Epictetus was not a teacher of emotional distance. He was a teacher of precise philosophical attention to the structure of experience And the structure he was pointing to here is this: the things that are loved are not possessed in the first place. They arrive, they are present for a time, and they depart according to forces that had nothing to do with the lover's will when they arrived and have nothing to do with it when they leave. The word return is philosophically deliberate. What is returned was always on loan. The relationship of the holder to the held was always one of care and presence rather than permanent possession. This does not diminish the care. It relocates the love away from the category of ownership, away from the structure in which the loss of a thing is the loss of something that was, in any final sense, yours. A person who loves genuinely and holds with this kind of internal reservation, not cold distance, but the warm, clear awareness that the beloved is not a property, meets loss differently, not without pain, but without the particular additional pain of feeling that reality has transgressed on something it owed them, that the world has reached into what was rightly theirs and taken it by force. The loss is real. The additional structure of violation that ownership would have created, that belongs to a judgment that can be quietly set down. This is Epictetus at his most intimate, and it is worth noting that the intimacy comes from the fact that he taught this, not as philosophical theory arrived at through argument, but as a practical orientation tested in the only place philosophy is genuinely tested, in the conditions of an actual life, against the actual resistance of experience. He had returned many things. He had returned his freedom for years to a man who claimed to own him. He had returned his city, Rome, with its noise and scale, when he was expelled and sent to Nicopolis. He had returned comfortable anonymity when Arian wrote down his teachings and they began to travel beyond the school. In each of these, the teaching was not separate from the experience. The teaching was the experience, held at the angle of philosophy until it became livable, which brings us to the concept that Epictetus spent years placing at the center of his teaching, the concept that Marcus Aurelius, who would later sit in a military tent on the banks of the Danube and write to himself about it by lamplight, called the inner citadel. The phrase is Marcus's, but the ground beneath it is entirely Epictetan. To hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, is the term Epictetus used for the center of the self, the seat of rational judgment and moral assent, where all the genuine work of a philosophical life occurs. Everything that makes a person philosophically who they are, their judgments about what is good, their assent to what is true, their orientation toward what they pursue and what they avoid, lives here, in this faculty, and nowhere else. What cannot reach it is considerable. Another person's words cannot alter it without the ruling faculty's own participation. An external circumstance cannot degrade it without the faculty's decision to treat degradation as real. An unjust authority can command the body, can relocate the person, can restrict the range of physical motion and social participation to any degree it chooses, and none of this, in the most precise philosophical sense, constitutes a breach of the ruling faculty, because the ruling faculty does not live in the body. It lives in the specific, identified location where judgment forms and assent is given, and that location has never been successfully occupied by any external force. This is not a metaphor designed to console. Epictetus was not in the business of consoling fictions. He was in the business of identifying, with the precision of someone who had tested his claims in conditions that most philosophical claims are never tested in, what is actually inviolable in the structure of a human self, and reporting what he found. What he found is this: there is a space inside the act of rational judgment and moral assent that no key fits, and no command can enter, not an imagined space, not a space that requires special conditions to exist, not a space that becomes available only to the philosophically advanced. It is simply the location where choosing and judging actually happen, and it has the structural characteristic present in every human being capable of reflection, of being activated only from within. The inner citadel is not a fortress under siege, defending against waves of external assault. The image of siege gets the architecture wrong. It is more like a room that has always been unlocked from the inside, always inhabited, never truly threatened by the things that appeared threatening, because the things that appeared threatening were directed at a different address. When Epictetus sat across from the student who had been passed over for the honor, the pause before his answer was itself a demonstration of what this looked like from the outside. A man fully present to another person's distress. A man who had found through long practice and through the particular school of experience that slavery and exile provided, the room inside the ruling faculty, and who now lived there with the consistency of someone who has stopped needing to find it because they have stopped leaving. The student might leave and return many times. That was permitted. The philosophy did not demand instantaneous and permanent relocation. It demanded the honest effort of return, again and again, to the only place where genuine peace was structurally available, rather than the place where peace was promised by circumstances and revoked without notice. What Epictetus was offering across all of these specific teachings, the theatrical role, the reservation in action, the anatomy of an insult, the return of what was on loan, was a single internally consistent orientation toward the question that arrives, in various forms, in the middle of every life. What do I actually own? And what was I never equipped to own? And what becomes available when I set down the second category? The answer is not nothing. It is not resignation, and it is not the hollow cheerfulness of someone pretending that the things they have lost were not real. It is the specific, quiet availability of the ruling faculty at full capacity, all of the attention, all of the judgment, all of the moral commitment, none of it dispersed across the management of circumstances that were moving according to their own logic, regardless of how much energy was directed at them. The freedom that Epictetus named was internal, and he named it with the personal authority of a man who had lived without the external version long enough to know the difference between them from the inside. A slave who has mastered the ruling faculty is, in the only philosophical sense of the term, more free than an emperor who has not, because freedom in the Epictetus sense is not a condition of politics or law. It is a condition of the relationship between the self and its own orientations. It is the specific quality of a person who does not need the world to arrange itself in any particular way in order to bring the full weight of their character to whatever it has arranged. This is what he meant, and it is a claim that requires the speaker to have tested it in conditions that most philosophical claims are never tested in. Epictetus had. He said it from the other side of the test, which is why it carries the weight it carries, and why students traveled to Nicopolis to sit in a small school and hear a former slave teach philosophy, without notes, without manuscript, without any of the institutional apparatus that philosophy usually needs to seem authoritative. The authority was already in the room. It was in the specific cadence of a man who had found what was truly his and was no longer at risk of losing it to any force arranged by any circumstance in any city. In the evenings in Nicopolis, when the teaching sessions were over and the students had left, Epictetus returned to what his biographers describe as a simple household with few possessions: an earthenware lamp, a pallet, the portable minimum of a life organized around the recognition that almost nothing in the category of objects was genuinely necessary to the life he was living. There is something worth pausing on in the image of that lamp, not because simplicity is itself the teaching. Epictetus was not an ascetic for the sake of performance, and he did not counsel the deliberate pursuit of discomfort as a philosophical exercise. He simply found that most of what was typically accumulated in the course of a Roman life was composed of things whose presence or absence had no bearing on the condition of the ruling faculty, and that a life organized around that recognition left more space, not for deprivation, but for the quality of attention that philosophy at its best requires. The lamp was adequate. The philosophy in the room with the lamp was abundant. Nothing was missing that was genuinely his to possess. What the students carried away from Nicopolis was not a system, it was a practice, a daily, patient, returnable orientation toward the question of what belongs to the faculty of choice and what belongs to the world's independent movement. It required no special equipment. It required no favorable circumstances. It was, by design, available precisely at the moments when circumstances were least favorable, when the night was long, when the honor had gone to another man, when the words had been sharp and public, when the journey had been interrupted by weather, when the thing that had been loved had been returned to wherever it came from. At those moments, and these are the moments that matter, the ruling faculty is available, not because circumstances have been resolved, because the ruling faculty was never dependent on their resolution. It was always there, in the specific location where judgment forms and assent is given, unlocked from the inside, waiting in the patient way that things wait when they are not going anywhere. A person who has genuinely inhabited this teaching for long enough will not feel it as philosophy. They will feel it as the quality of their own morning, the steadiness with which they meet a revised plan, the pause they find available before responding to a sharp remark, the quiet at the end of a day that did not go as arranged. These are not small things. They are the texture of a life, accumulated across thousands of days, shaped by the practice of returning, again and again, to the one domain that is genuinely theirs. The inner citadel is not a fortress. It is a room that has always been unlocked from the inside. It is always inhabited, even when the inhabitant has temporarily left to pursue something in the external domain that turned out not to be theirs to keep. It is always available, always the same room, always at the same address, which is not a geography but a posture, the specific posture of a self that has oriented itself toward what is genuinely and inalienably its own. The listener does not need to travel to find it. No journey is required, because no distance separates anyone from the ruling faculty. The room is not at the end of a search. The search, it turns out, was the only thing standing between the seeker and a door that was never locked. Epictetus knew this address from long personal acquaintance. He gave it freely in a small school in a city of exile to anyone who came and was willing to sit with the patience that the teaching requires. The sitting is not difficult. The patience is not unusual. What is required is simply the honest willingness to look at what one is holding and ask, with the genuine simplicity that Epictetus brought to every question, does this belong to me? Is this mine to keep? Or is this something that was always, at some quiet and fundamental level, already on its way back? The question does not demand an answer tonight. It only asks to be held in the specific, unhurried way that things can be held in the dark, when the world has gone quiet enough to let a person feel the weight and the shape of what they have been carrying, and to notice, without urgency, without resolution, that something here at the center has always been steady. Something has not been touched by the noise. Something has been here all along, in the room that the world cannot enter, waiting without impatience, because it was never going anywhere, because it is the only thing that was ever genuinely and finally and completely theirs. Somewhere in the ancient world, before either tradition had settled on its name, two men sat in the early morning with the same question resting between them like an object neither had yet picked up. One of them had come from a community of practice in the hills east of the Mediterranean. One of them had come from the city, from teachers who spoke of reason and the good life. Neither of them knew the other existed. Neither of them needed to. The question they were both sitting with was old enough that it required no introduction, and it went something like this. Of all the things the mind reaches for and holds and worries over in the night, how many of them actually belong to the mind, and how many are only passing through, briefly borrowed, impossible to keep? The Buddhist practitioner would have had a word for the reaching. The word was upadana. It meant clinging, but not in the dramatic sense, not the white-knuckled grip of someone refusing to let go of something they know they must release. It was subtler than that. It was the ordinary, almost automatic adhesion of the mind to its objects, the way attention fuses with what it attends to and begins, without deciding to treat that thing as its own. The pleasant sensation clung to, the outcome pursued with such commitment that the pursuing and the outcome became indistinguishable. The reputation, the opinion, the words spoken by someone across a crowded room, carried home and turned over through the night until it had grown into something the original speaker would not recognize. The Stoic practitioner, sitting in a different century, in a different landscape, would have named the same movement differently. The word was orexis, desire, but desire aimed at the wrong address, sent toward things that live outside the boundary of what the mind can govern, and therefore returning unanswered, or answered badly, or answered in a way that satisfied only long enough to make the next reaching feel necessary. Both men were circling the same fact about the mind's relationship to its world. Both of them had noticed that the suffering was not in the things themselves, but in the architecture of the reaching. And both of them had begun, in their different languages and their different landscapes, to describe the same interior work, the gradual, patient practice of noticing where the reaching goes, and learning, slowly, without forcing it, to let the hand open. It is worth staying with this for a moment, not as a comparison exercise, not as intellectual mapping, but because there is something in the convergence itself that carries its own weight. Two traditions arriving at the same description of the mind's difficulty, from different directions, in different centuries, without reference to each other, suggests that what they were describing was not a philosophical position, but an observation, something that was simply there, waiting to be noticed, which different forms of careful attention kept finding because it was findable. The leaf detaches from the branch and falls. The question is not whether the practitioner cares about the leaf. The question is whether caring about the leaf has become, quietly and without announcement, caring about the leaf remaining, and whether the difference between those two things, small as it sounds, is where all the night's difficulty actually lives. A leaf falls in both traditions. In the Buddhist account, it falls in a world where all composite things are impermanent, where clinging to any of them as permanent is a form of misunderstanding the world's nature, rather than a moral failing. In the Stoic account, it falls in a world governed by the rational order of things, what the Stoics called the logos, where the leaf's falling is not an accident or a loss, but the expression of a necessity that extends from the smallest particular to the whole of what exists. The two accounts are not the same. They part ways on several important questions. But the psychological destination they are pointing toward, the specific quality of attention that can be present with the leaf, can care about it fully, and can allow it to fall without installing its remaining as the precondition of the watcher's peace, that destination is close enough that a person arriving at it by either road would recognize someone who had arrived by the other. Epictetus never wrote about Buddhism. The traditions ran parallel, separated by enough geography and enough noise that the convergence remained accidental and unannounced. But to sit with both of them now, in a dark room, at the end of a long day, is to notice that what they are both offering is something remarkably practical. Not an argument, not a position to be adopted, a form of attention, a way of noticing the mind's automatic reach toward its objects, and pausing, briefly, gently, without judgment, to ask whether the thing being reached for is in the domain of what can be held, or whether it lives somewhere else entirely, somewhere outside the jurisdiction of whatever it is that reaches. This question has a long philosophical neighborhood. Aristotle asked it, in his way, though he arrived at a different answer. Writing in Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era, he had looked at the good life with the same seriousness that Epictetus would later bring, and he had concluded that virtue mattered enormously, that character, the cultivated habits of response and choice that a person builds across a lifetime, was central to genuine human flourishing. On this, he and the Stoics were not far apart. But Aristotle had also looked at the lives of actual human beings and had noticed something that he was unwilling to argue away. Health mattered, friendship mattered, in the deep sense, not as a luxury, but as something structurally necessary to the kind of life worth calling well-lived. Enough material sufficiency to be free from constant want mattered. He was not willing to say, as Epictetus would say, that a person stripped of all of these could be as fully well as a person who possessed them, so long as the inner disposition remained sound. The disagreement between them is not a problem to be solved. It is a philosophical boundary that marks exactly where the two accounts part. Aristotle saw the external goods, health, friendship, civic participation, a sufficiency of material comfort, as genuine components of eudaimonia, of human flourishing, not merely as pleasant extras. He would have said that a philosophy which claims otherwise is making the world more abstract than it actually is, that it is performing a kind of conceptual tidiness that leaves out something real about what human beings are and what they need. Epictetus, who had lived without nearly all of those things for a long portion of his life, had found something different. He had found that the internal territory, the territory of judgment, assent, the quality of attention brought to whatever was happening, could remain intact, could remain genuinely one's own, in conditions that had stripped the external goods away completely. He was not arguing from theory. He was reporting from observation, from the specific laboratory of a life that had been, by external measures, very poor. The tension between them is worth sitting with rather than resolving, because the question is genuinely open. Whether the Stoic claim that virtue alone is sufficient for the good life, that genuine well-being requires nothing outside the quality of one's own inner orientation, is literally true, or whether Aristotle was right that certain external things are genuine components of the good, rather than merely preferred indifference, is a question that careful philosophers have been sitting with for a very long time without arriving at a settled answer. What both of them agree on, and what may be the most useful thing to carry into the night, is that character matters, that the cultivated quality of one's responses to what happens is not a secondary or decorative concern, but something central, something worth spending a life on. The distance between them, between Aristotle's generous account of what human flourishing requires and Epictetus's stripped and radical one is also a description of the range within which the question lives. And the question has been there, open and patient, for a very long time. Several centuries after Aristotle, in a city far from Athens, a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza sat in Amsterdam and worked on an account of reality that would have looked very strange to both of them, but that led by an entirely different route to something recognizable from the end of its road. Spinoza was building a system, a rigorous, geometrically organized account of what exists and why, and the conclusion he arrived at was that everything that happens necessarily as an expression of the infinite, rational nature of what exists. He called this nature God, or nature, treating the terms as interchangeable. He meant by it not a person, not a will standing outside the world and making decisions about it, but the whole of what is, understood from within, governed by a necessity as complete and as impersonal as mathematics. The Stoics had something like this in the doctrine of the Logos, the rational principle immanent in all things, present in matter, in organic life, and most fully in human reason. The Stoics called the necessity of events heimarmene, fate, and they meant by it not a dramatic predetermination, but the rational unfolding of a world governed through and through by the same order that makes human reason possible. To resist what happens, in this account, is a kind of philosophical self-contradiction. It is the Logos resisting itself, reason refusing the rational order from which it emerged. Spinoza arrived at a closely neighboring place from his very different starting point. He called it subspecie eternitatis, seeing things under the aspect of eternity, perceiving events not as they appear to the anxious particular perspective of the individual caught inside time, but as they are in their full necessary, impersonal character. The fire that destroys the harvest, seen from within the loss, is catastrophe, seen under the aspect of eternity, as the expression of a nature that has no preference for outcomes, that cannot be otherwise than it is. It is simply what happened, in a world where things happen in the only way they can. This does not make the loss unfelt. Spinoza was not asking for numbness. He was describing a shift of perspective so radical and so demanding that he was honest about how difficult it was to achieve, and honest, too, about how much it changed the quality of a mind that managed to hold it. The psychological destination is the same one the Stoics were pointing at. Not resignation, which gives up the attempt and calls that peace. Not indifference, which refuses the feeling to avoid the pain, but a form of genuine acceptance grounded in understanding, in actually apprehending the necessity of what happened, which is a different thing from merely telling oneself to accept it. The Stoic instruction in Epictetus was always pointed in this direction. Not tell yourself this does not matter, but look clearly at what this actually is, at what domain it belongs to, and let the clarity itself do the work. Spinoza's geometrical necessity and the Stoic Logos are not the same idea, and they lead to different places on several important questions. But the peace they are both pointing at, the specific quiet of a mind that has stopped fighting the structure of what exists, is recognizable from either approach, which suggests that the structure they are both responding to is real, or at least that the need for this particular peace is. The Stoic architecture has a way of re-emerging. It comes back in forms that do not announce themselves as Stoic, in voices that did not read Epictetus, in moments so far from Athens and Nicopolis that the connection could only be noticed afterward, from a distance. In the middle of the 20th century, a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a short prayer that was used in a church service in a small town in New England, and then was passed along to a military chaplain, and then began to travel into the notebooks and meetings and quiet agreements of people who were trying to find a way to live with things they could not change. The prayer asked for serenity to accept what could not be changed, courage to change what could, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Niebuhr was not, by his own account, thinking of Epictetus when he wrote it. He was working from his own theological and philosophical tradition, arriving at a formulation that fit the need of the moment and the people in front of him. But the structure of the prayer is the structure of the dichotomy, the two categories, what can be changed and what cannot, what belongs to the domain of one's action and what belongs to the domain of the world's indifferent proceeding, are the same two categories that Epictetus placed at the opening of the Enchiridion as the foundation on which everything else rested. The prayer has no philosophical apparatus attached to it. It does not distinguish proheresis from external circumstance, does not speak of the logos or the preferred indifference. It is 27 words, and those 27 words have traveled into places of genuine difficulty, church basements, hospital corridors, the small hours of the night when something cannot be fixed and needs somehow to be lived with, and have been useful there in a way that suggests the shape of the distinction is not a philosophical invention, but something closer to a description of how the mind is built and what it needs. There is something in that usefulness worth noticing slowly, a distinction articulated in the first century of the Common Era by a man who had no external freedom and had found the distinction nonetheless operative in his own experience. Reemerges 20 centuries later in a prayer written by a man who had not heard of it, and then travels into the lives of people who had not read either of them, and is recognized there as true, not as an interesting idea, as true, in the way that a key is true, in the specific sense of fitting the lock that was waiting for it. The philosophical pedigree does not matter to the person in the church basement. The argument does not matter. What matters is that the distinction once made is recognizable, that something in the ordinary human experience of difficulty already knew the difference between these two domains and needed only the words to name what it already understood. Epictetus would not have been surprised. He was not a philosopher who thought the value of philosophy was its novelty. He thought the value of philosophy was its accuracy, its capacity to describe what was actually there, in the structure of experience, in the nature of the mind, and its relationship to its world. A teaching that kept being found, kept being rediscovered, kept being recognized by people who had not been taught it, was, in his terms, evidence that it was describing something real. The laboratory for philosophical truth was not the argument but the life, and the life kept returning the same result. Viktor Frankl had not in any straightforward sense been a philosopher of the Stoic tradition. He was a psychiatrist in Vienna in the early part of the 20th century, working on a theory of human meaning that drew from clinical observation and phenomenological philosophy, and a set of insights about what his patients seemed to need in order to endure what they could not change. Then the circumstances of his life became something no theoretical framework could have prepared him for entirely, and the theory he had been building was tested in the only way that produces genuine evidence, by being lived in conditions of absolute extremity, in a concentration camp, stripped of everything that external circumstances can strip from a person: home, family, profession, freedom of movement, the ordinary protections of a civilized society, the control of nearly every physical condition of his existence. Frankl noticed something. He noticed it the way a scientist notices something in the middle of an experiment that was not supposed to go this way, carefully, with a kind of terrible precision, because the noticing was the only form of integrity that remained available to him. What he noticed was that something persisted, not hope in the ordinary sense of expecting things to improve, because things were not improving and there was no reliable reason to believe they would. Not defiance, because defiance requires an audience and costs more than it produces, and something quieter than those things, and smaller and more durable. The way he chose to carry what was happening, the quality of attention he brought to the hour he was in, whether he treated the man beside him with dignity or did not, whether he found in the middle of what could not be made bearable by any ordinary standard something to be present to. He named it, afterward, the last of the human freedoms. The freedom to choose one's attitude toward one's circumstances when every other freedom has been taken. He said it carefully, not as a triumphant claim, not as a way of minimizing what had been done to him and to the people beside him, but as an honest report from the most extreme possible observation point, that even there, in conditions that had removed every external freedom, something had remained, something that was not a possession of the guards, not subject to the administration's decisions, not reducible to the physical condition of the body being depleted by cold and hunger and labor, a last irreducible domain of selfhood, not comfortable, not adequate compensation for what had been lost, but present, still in some fundamental sense, his Epictetus, who had lived in a different form of absolute external constraint, had named the same thing prohairesis, the deep habituated orientation of the self toward what it values and assents to as true, the one thing that no external force can occupy without the self's own voluntary surrender. The name is different. The circumstances that tested it were different in ways that matter and should not be collapsed into each other. But the thing being named is recognizably the same thing, the small, quiet, indestructible fact that even when the world has removed everything removable, something remains that was never the world's to remove, not as a gift, not as a compensation, simply as a structural feature of what it is to be a self, which turns out to be something that cannot be entirely expropriated, even by the most thorough forms of expropriation human beings have been able to devise. Frankl did not arrive at this through reading Stoic texts. He arrived at it through the same route Epictetus had arrived at his version, through the actual experience of having nothing else. This is perhaps why the claim carries a different weight than the same claim would carry coming from a position of comfort. It is easy to say that internal freedom is sufficient when external freedom is also present. It costs nothing to affirm that the quality of one's inner responses matters most when one's external circumstances are not in question. What is harder, what the lives of both of these men demonstrate with a specificity that no argument could equal, is that the claim holds not as consolation, but as observation, even when external conditions have become as bad as they can get. The claim, tested in those conditions, came back confirmed, not triumphantly, quietly, with the specific authority of something found to be true in the one laboratory where it mattered. There is a long thread connecting the porch in Athens, where Zeno first spoke to passers-by about virtue and the good life, and the camp where Frankl noticed what remained. The thread is not a story of progress, not a steady accumulation of insight moving toward a conclusion. It is something less dramatic and more reliable than that. It is the same question, held by different hands in different centuries, kept alive by the fact that it describes something real in the structure of experience that each new generation of difficulty keeps needing a name for. The question does not solve anything. The distinction between what belongs to the self and what does not will not make the hard things easy, but it has a way of making them livable, of converting what felt like an intolerable burden into a situation that can be met with something, met with whatever quality of attention and intention and dignity remains available to the person standing in it. The night has a particular relationship to this question. In the dark, when the day's activity has stopped and the mind is left with what it has been accumulating, the inventory of worries tends to be heavy in the category of things that cannot be governed. What others thought, what might happen, what cannot now be undone, what the morning might bring. This is not a malfunction of the mind. It is the mind doing what minds do, which is reach toward everything that seems to matter and try to manage it. The Stoic teaching and the Buddhist teaching and Frankl's report from the far edge of human experience and Niebuhr's prayer in a small church in New England are all at their center about the same moment, the moment when the inventory is taken and the question is asked, not as a philosophical exercise, but as something genuinely necessary. Which of these things is actually mine to hold, not which of them matters? That is a different question, and often the wrong one. The things that cannot be governed can matter enormously. The outcome of something important, the response of someone loved, the turn that history is taking, these things matter, and the Stoic teaching is not that they do not. The teaching is more precise than that. It distinguishes between caring about something and staking the governance of one's own inner life on that something resolving in a particular way. The farmer in the field cares about the crop. The care is real, expressed in every careful choice made through the growing season, in every precaution taken, in every hour of genuine labor. But the farmer who has been thinking clearly, who has been practicing the form of attention that Epictetus and the Buddhist practitioner and Spinoza, under the aspect of eternity, and Frankl, in his stripped and terrible freedom, were all describing, carries inside the caring something else as well, a small reservation, not a refusal to care, a recognition that the weather is not theirs, that the outcome lives outside the boundary of what caring can govern, and that this does not make the caring less. It makes the caring cleaner, more honest, better fitted to what caring can actually do. The reservation is not visible from the outside. The farmer looks the same, the care is the same, the labor is the same. What is different is internal, a small, quiet space inside the investment where the outcome is not yet installed as the measure of everything, where the goodness of the work is not entirely dependent on the weather's cooperation. That space is what Epictetus was describing when he spoke of acting with reservation, of pursuing every worthwhile goal with full commitment while holding the attachment to the specific outcome with an open hand. It is what the Buddhist practitioner was practicing when sitting with the falling leaf. It is what Spinoza was pointing at with his eternal perspective. It is what Frankl found still present in conditions where everything held with anything other than an open hand had been taken. It is what Niebuhr's prayer asked for in the form of serenity, not the absence of feeling, but the specific quality of equanimity that can feel everything and still remain at its center, intact. The philosophy that Epictetus taught in Nicopolis to students who came from across the Roman world to sit in a simple schoolroom and hear a man who had once been someone else's property describe the nature of genuine freedom. That philosophy did not claim to make things easy. Epictetus was not a purveyor of comfort. He was a teacher of precision, and the precision he was offering was sharp enough to cut through a great deal of what the mind spends its nights on. He was not saying that the difficult things do not matter. He was saying something more useful, that the difficult things can be met, that meeting them is different from managing them, and that the quality of the meeting which is entirely the practitioner's own, is what genuine philosophy is for. Not to resolve the world, not to make the weather cooperative, or the outcome certain, or the people around us predictable. To find, inside every situation, however difficult, the one domain that has always been and will always remain genuinely available, the domain of how this is met, with what quality of attention, with what degree of honesty, with what care for the thing that is actually one's own to give. This is the thread. This is what has been carried forward, in different names, across different centuries, by people who needed it for reasons as different as each of their lives. It is carried not because it is intellectually satisfying, though it is, not because it resolves the oldest questions, though it reshapes them. It is carried because it is useful in the dark, in the night's particular inventory, when the mind is finally still enough to ask which of the things it has been holding all day are actually its to hold. Outside, somewhere, the dark is doing what the dark does, patient, unhurried, indifferent to the specific anxieties of any particular night.